Welcome to another episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Designers. In today's episode, we have a special guest, Jasmine, and we have co-hosting today's session is Stella. Say hi, Stella. Say hi, Jasmine.
Hello.
All right. So today we'll talk about basically we'll be talking about the UX copywriting and maybe how people could follow into your footsteps, Jasmine, in the next few minutes. All right, Jasmine, how are you?
Good, good. Morning
Yeah,
there. Good
yeah,
morning.
yeah. Good morning, good morning. So, yeah, we start off our discussions usually with tell us your origin story. So, please, Jasmine, tell
Sure.
us your origin story.
Yeah, so I grew up partly in the US and partly in Manila. I did my first 2 years of college at Ateneo, and then I transferred to Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts in the US. I dabbled a lot with internships at Sony Pictures, and also 17 magazine long before back in the day, publishing. And then I started as a copywriter actually at McCann Erickson Manila. And then I moved to the States, and I got a job in advertising as a copywriter. And then I switched over to more product marketing writing, and that's where I did my work at The Gap and Shutterfly. And then gradually, the industry of UX started to develop, right? And I was actually starting to evolve from copywriting to UX writing without even knowing it. And I don't know if, even the company itself knew it, right? Because it was so nascent, it was so new. But eventually I did, a sort of hard switch into being my first UX role at a startup called Just Answer, and then moved on to Facebook. And then now I'm currently at Netflix.
Nice, nice. So, Stella, what's your questions on UX, right? Go ahead,
Sure.
Stella.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Jasmine, thanks so much for giving us a quick background about your experience. I think what was super interesting was how you mentioned that you transitioned into UX writing without you even knowing it. And UX writing is definitely an emerging industry in the Philippines. And for our Filipino listeners, I think it would be awesome if you could maybe explain to us the difference or similarity of UX writing and copywriting. That would be awesome.
Sure. One of the reasons I wanted to switch over to UX writing or content, there are many different names for it. Sometimes it's called UX writing, content strategy, content design. But the reason I wanted to switch is because I didn't just want to work on how to say the words, right? I wanted to actually work on the content and like why we're saying it, and really getting deep into, things like user journeys, think, feel, do exercises, and really coming from I want to say actually a theatrical perspective. I used to act in theater in Tanghalang Ateneo.
Wow.
And, I bring that with me because I think part of theater is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, getting deep, coming from that perspective. And that's a lot of what UX writers do. They try to put themselves into the shoes of the user, of the people using the product. So I would say that is the biggest shift.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting how empathy is such a salient theme, no, in the UX industry. So could you tell us about the skill sets of a UX writer? What other skills do you think have helped you apart from the empathy that you've learned from this experience in theater? Like maybe you have other experiences that have allowed you to be at the position you're at right now.
I would say being thoughtful, really thoughtful, and sort of deliberate about your process, right? Yeah. Thinking about what your goals are, what you're trying to do, what are the compromises you're going to have to make, right? A lot of times when you're in a position, you're trying to serve both the business and the user, and sometimes those things don't match, and it's really, really hard. There was an experience I had when I was working at one of my previous roles where, they wanted to give the users the ability to refund, right? But at the same, so you wanted to make it very clear, hey, this is where you refund. Here's the big CTA button, all that stuff, and that would be user focused. At the same time, the business could not take that big a hit if it was so prominent that every single person started refunding. So it's really balancing those business and user goals.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. So I'm so sure that the role you have in UX writing is very imbued in the entire design process when people are coming up with wireframes, new products, new parts of Netflix or whatever you guys are working on. So maybe you can tell us about your experience of working with Netflix, what the team dynamic is like, whatever you're allowed to share with us, of course. Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, one of the things I really admire about working at Netflix is the propensity for action, right? Like the bias toward action, but also the ability to give each other feedback. And parang sa kulturang Pilipino, for me, it's a little bit hard because there's a level of confrontation that needs to happen. And parang, huwag kang magagalit ha, pero sasabihin ko to sa'yo, parang ganon, di ba? So you have to,
you have to be nice.
Yes, and it's a muscle to exercise, right? And also, but being on the recipient end of that and saying, okay, I accept this feedback and I take what I will from it and then leave what I don't, right? It really, I say this all the time, I bring this up all the time, but I thought it was really interesting when a friend of mine, Dino Ignacio, he's doing design at Facebook, but he mentioned at one of the talks I attended that some of the words we use in Tagalog that translate to English soften us, so it makes us look a little more insecure than we actually are on the inside. So things like baka, siguro, things like that actually it's not in the language, but there is a level of translation. So yeah.
That's a really interesting note, about linguistics and how that affects the work culture, I guess. Ellie, do you have any questions? You want to chime in?
No, I just wanted to say that it's pretty interesting. We're similar to the Japanese, because in Japanese they don't say no. For instance, they say late. Would you like to have dinner later? And they would say later is a bit choto, so that they don't say no. They say later is a bit. So yeah, Filipinos are medyo. Although I think many Filipinos are starting to, especially those who are working remotely, internationally, are getting familiar with different cultures. So I've noticed that there has been a shift lately, especially in a tech world. Just add to what you said.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think as Filipinos, we're always trying to be encouraged to adapt globally or adapt to what we think is global. But on the other hand, being on the other side now that I'm working in the United States, I'm always trying to make sure that the U.S. considers the Filipinos and the other side of the world, right? I always wonder to myself, when I'm using the apps we use every day, what would happen if a Filipino wrote this? Would it be more magalang? Would it say would it, instead of get started, would it have a more fun tone? Would it have tara na? Or instead of yes, oo and hindi, yes or no and buttons, would it have opo hindi po? Would it be more? It's interesting how culture shapes the product experiences that we build,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you've openly spoken about this, for example, in your episode with Alexis Collado on Roots, no? About representation in the industry and how that's such a big part of your why. So maybe we could dive into that. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in any culture, place, there's always this sense of power and privilege and those who do not have that power and privilege. So in every role that I've been in every company I've been in, I've always been an advocate for making sure that we accommodate for that, right? So for example, it's okay, this is understood, this language is understood by most Filipinos, right? English is mostly understood, but we have to make sure that it's not just understood by the people who can afford a great education, right? We have to make sure it's democratic. So those are the kinds of thoughts that come to mind when I think of representation, and also not just cultural representation or language, but also it could be your level of tech comfort, right? Of explaining it to people that might not understand. I mean, I've had conversations with my parents who are I still don't understand what you do. I'm the words in the app, and they're there are no words in the app. Well, I think actually that's probably the benefit of good UX when you don't even know, like it works so
Yes,
seamlessly.
it's
You don't
invisible.
notice it. Yes.
Correct, correct.
No, that's a really interesting note there. Yeah, thanks for sharing that experience. Ellie, any questions?
No,
Anything you want to
I
bring up?
just wanted to share as well. So we did do when I was back in OLX. Now it's called Carousel here in the Philippines. One of the things that we tested was to for Cebuano users, would we need to use a Cebuano language for our website versus a Filipino language or an English language? And it turned out, based on our research, that a lot of them spoke in Cebuano, but they read in English. So that was a quite insightful experience for
Mhm.
us when we, in relation to having content and UX copy. And I suddenly just remembered when you were talking about, making content, making sure it's relevant for users. So very
Right.
interesting. Mhm.
It's fascinating because yeah, and everything, right? Even and there's so much nuance. Like for example, do Filipinos use a different way to chat with each other? Also, that's a consideration. So we might, even if we talk in English or Tagalog, when we text each other, is there like a shorthand version, right, of that you need to consider? So if you're making, like, let's say you're making a smart reply, maybe it cannot be right back. It'll have to be BRB or whatever equivalent of that is.
Or
Yeah.
the favorite lines like "Here na me, where na you." Are you familiar with that? Here na me, where na you?
D2 na me. D2 na me.
Ito na me, yeah.
With a
And
two.
the location,
D2 and M and
exactly.
yeah.
Like, I think that level of cultural consciousness now is super important in any kind of UX work. So I think this is a question I have for both of you guys, given your experiences in the industry. Like, how do you imbue that cultural consciousness or that need to understand, like, okay, like we are making this product for a wide range of people. Like, how do you imbue that in your design process? I guess this is, yeah,
Good
that is
question.
the question. Yeah. There, yeah, that is my question. Sorry.
Um, this seems so simple, but it's something I heard when I was working at Facebook. One of the first things that was said is, remember that you are not normal. You are not a normal person using your app. You have a depth of knowledge about it. You have years of experience in the tech industry. You are not normal. And that really stuck with me. It seems like such a simple thing, but it's always remembering that, hey, I need to do the work to understand my user through, customer research, usability tests, and I cannot rely on gut instinct or my own personal experience because I myself come with biases. And I think that's also why it's so important to build a robust, diverse team, because hopefully you fill in the gaps. I mean, I think that's the reason why there's been such a, kind of effort to not support this bro culture in tech, right? It shouldn't just be one kind of tone. It should be a variety of experiences, mindsets, and things like that.
Mhm.
It's good. It's good that you mentioned biases, because in my experience, throughout the years, that is the usual enemy that I've always encountered. Either the stakeholders' biases, the clients' biases, my own bias, developers' bias, and I think what I've learned in UX work is that is the enemy, the bias, the biases that we have. So yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Jasmine, that you mentioned that research is super important as part of the process. I mean, you do testing. Ellie, you briefly mentioned this before. Like validating certain claims or hypotheses that we might have about design. I mean, design decisions that have to be made. No,
Yeah.
so maybe you guys want to talk a bit about data-driven design decisions, or how data helps you guys in making decisions in your work. Jasmine, maybe with content strategy. Like, how does that work together? Maybe touching on that a little bit.
I'd like to say it's data informed versus
Data
data driven,
Okay.
because you're given the data and then you make decisions on that, right? So
Good
you
point.
know, depending on where you work, your company might have certain principles, and your design organization might have certain principles. And I think it's really on the responsibility of the design team to make sure that that gets put forward in their organization. So, like for example, you know what, we're not going to fool customers, or we're going to make getting a refund easy. Like those are things that are not metrics based, because you could certainly put out a test there or a product that will drive up sales or revenue, if you don't have those principles in place, right? So sometimes it does come down to, here's the data, here's the research, and then make the decision. But at least you have that information.
Yeah.
I like the word the use of the word data, the phrase data informed instead of data driven. Sometimes, you know, garbage data can drive a company's decision, and it's better to think about it first, before just relying on the data itself, and making that conscious distancing first, and making using the data but not necessarily following it entirely.
Nice. So thanks so much for that, you guys. It was just a insert question because we were on the topic. Yeah. So looking more on accessibility and representation, I think Jasmine, what we'd really be interested to know is how UX writing and UX content works with accessibility and inclusivity in building products. Maybe you could tell us
Yeah.
about that.
That's not necessarily my expertise, but I am aware of it. Whenever I usually work with an accessibility expert on that, right? Because I myself am able-bodied, like I come with that biases. But really just thinking about, and I think it goes back to our conversation around empathy, right? It's about serving users, and our users are diverse, and that's why we need to make sure that we consider all those diverse backgrounds and perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, really awesome. Ellie, any notes on that? Any thoughts on that, maybe with your experience?
Now, that's why we always get a we've had Julius, a visually impaired person, in a couple of our previous
Right.
conference events, right? Because they really do have insights that we don't necessarily see. In Ateneo, we 2 years ago in Ateneo we had a competition for with the visually impaired people. We call it VIPs, visually impaired people, and they had the design a website for the visually impaired. And there was a funny scene there where these were students who were working with visually impaired people just beside them. And then, one of the funny scenes there was, one of the designers, the students, was talking to the VIP beside him and saying, "What do you think of this design?" Showing that design to them. And I saw him and said, "Oh, this is why we have this competition, for you to consult." And that you realize he doesn't see that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I just remember that all of a sudden when we're talking about this.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, though, I will say that it does come into consideration when you think about the words we use, right? So, using view all or see all, is that the right term? Like thinking about
Correct. Yes, that's a good insight. How about we were talking earlier about representation, right, in the industry, especially where you are right now. How is it like, and how what would you say about that?
Yeah, I think I would love to see more Filipinos in this field, and that's why I'm here, right? Because I want to serve as a resource if people have questions about the field. I know it's still nascent there, and I'd love to, be just a support in any way I can. I'd love for more Filipinos to be in tech, and I know there are significantly there, but if you look at percentages, it's not much. And I think that if we are thinking about, all these companies, if they're thinking about being global, that must be considered, especially with the amount of usage in the Philippines.
I agree.
Technology. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You're saying something, Stella.
No, no, no. I was just saying exactly what you had said, Ellie. Thank you so much for sharing that experience with us, and that's amazing. Of course, representation in any industry, knowing that Filipinos even can come out and be in that industry is amazing. And you being an example for us is honestly we're on the right track. We're on the right track. So I guess we've got 5 more minutes, and I guess we could really talk about. Well, I mean, no, maybe you could run us through maybe some tips who want to go into your field. People who are interested maybe in UX writing, want to explore it deeper as a career. Maybe you could give some tips or advice for people who are in my position, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at content design, it's not just in the Philippines that it's nascent. It's in everywhere in the world. It's an emerging industry. I mean, it's established, but at the same time, it's still so new, right? If you compare it to other roles, I will say that obviously having a writing background on some level, although there are content designers or content strategists that don't necessarily write, that is an advantage. But also, there's such a variety of paths to get here. Like I've known people who have come from a journalist background, people who've come from an advertising background, from a library science background, right? But I think the commonality is really just being very inquisitive and very, like I said earlier, very deliberate about the choices you make, thinking about things like the tone of voice, thinking about terminologies, glossaries. How do you make it clear to people? How do you guide them through a process? Thinking about things from sort of a strategic lens versus just like, oh, this is the quick, witty tagline that we can get out there. Thinking about the entire journey as a whole is really helpful. And one thing I also will say is, I think as someone who grew up in the Philippines, a lot of times, sometimes we're our own worst enemies, where we think, oh, you know what? And I think it's changing. It's not like that anymore. It's gradually changing, but it's like, well, I've never seen a Filipina in that position before. So I'm probably not qualified for that position, or I'm never going to get that position. But you know, you can't get there if you don't try, right? And it's also all these little steps that people take to actually get there. One of the, I'm hoping to write this, I will soon, but one of the mistakes I made, honestly, and then this is a moment of vulnerability for me, is not putting Ateneo on my resume.
Oh,
Because I thought, you know what, no one recognizes it in the States. No one knows it. So why will I write it, right? And you know, I transferred from there anyway. I didn't graduate from there. But then the more I thought about it, and the more people I met from colleges from the Philippines, I said, you know what? How will we elevate the colleges in the Philippines to that status if we don't put it out there, right? If employers in the US or elsewhere don't start seeing it come up again and again and again and think, oh, this candidate's really qualified, this candidate's really qualified.
yeah.
So it's those little things that I, you know, looking back in my career now, I start to think about like, okay, what are the ways we can really elevate our community?
Yeah, thank you for that. You are an inspiration to a lot of Filipinos and Filipinas, like who want to go into this career field, this field as well. And I'm actually you posted a couple of months ago in the group about opportunities, and I'm glad that you're sharing those kinds of opportunities to us locally as well. Do you have any last questions, Stella?
No, I think we ended on a perfect note. Unless you have anything else to add, Jasmine, any parting words, last thoughts if you want to share with any of our listeners?
Yeah.
No, I just want to offer myself as here as a resource. So yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you very much for today's episode, Stella. Thank you for co-hosting. It's really,
sure. Yeah,
you're always a very good host.
Yeah, honestly, no, thank you so much for having me, you guys. Really, I mean, part of this is also me just throwing questions out there, questions I see, questions I have with friends, colleagues that are also fresh in the industry. So knowing that you guys are here to answer those questions is honestly amazing. So on behalf of the younger batch, I guess, of those coming in the industry, thank you, lad.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
The younger batch. Oh, by the way, next week we're getting the younger batch like you for our session. And then Jasmine, thank you very much for taking the time to having this session with us live.
Thank you. I'm so glad I could be part of it.
Okay. And for everyone who is watching, we've been having around 10 to 15 live viewers, and I didn't really advertise this, so they must be really be interested in hearing you, Jasmine. Feel free to chat with Jasmine. He's in our community, and thank you all for watching our conversations with designers. If you'd like to see the rest of the episodes, go to Designers.cam, and thank you very much. Bye bye now. Bye. Say bye bye.